Hey, I am Tony PharmD, and I wanted to go over student loan debt with you a little bit. We've talked a lot about it on social media recently. Some podcasts have come out that have some excellent advice about student loan debt and things like that, your financial pharmacist and so forth. But I wanted to talk about something that I didn't see, which seems to be the most obvious puzzle that just really doesn't make sense. And part of my job is to help students make good decisions about pharmacy schools, and a lot of them are certainly going to look at the finances. And I wanted to kind of look at the puzzle and see if you can help me solve it. So I appreciate any comments you can make about what you think. So the first thing is the law of supply and demand. And those of you that have taken economics and so forth, this isn't really a law. There's a lot of reasons why this doesn't work. But what it does is it gives us kind of a common framework to work from, and it lets us know that there's something happening that's counterintuitive. So the number of pharmacy schools has gone up. I'll show you charts about that. And then the applications for pharmacy school has gone down. Just the Academic Pharmacy Now that came out like a week ago has that it went from 85,000 to 65,000 applications since 2010, so recent data. And the hypothesis is that under a condition of increased supply and decreased demand, we're going to drive down the tuition and the debt of pharmacy students is going to go down, which is a really good thing. So let's look at what happens. Here's the increased supply, and I'm totally dating myself here, but I went to college in 1993, and back then 73 schools of pharmacy. It's now 138, and 55 were public and 18 were private, about 75%. And then there was kind of this creep of, we went from 55 public schools to 57 in those 24 years, not 24, in those 19 years. And then the privates went from 18 to 48. So as a percentage, you can see that there's a huge increase in the number of privates, just a tiny little increase in the number of publics. And the number of publics is actually going up. It seems like this multiple campus thing is a thing now. And it's about 50-50 now. Okay? But something I do want you to notice is that, and this is going to be one of the things that I'm really excited about, is that if you look at the percent of people that were borrowing in 2012, it was about 88.7. And this slope makes it a little bit, it doesn't show it as well as it maybe should, but and then it went up to 90, 89, 88, 87, 86. So the percent of students borrowing is actually going down. So students are saying, you know what, I don't want any part of that debt. And so we went from 10% to 14%. And you might not think that's a big number, but 1% of all the pharmacy students that are there, that's a big number. So here we have the increased supply, obviously from 2012 to 2017, we have more pharmacy schools, but we have a doubling from 1993 to 2017 where we are now. So that's the takeaway. We have an increased supply. Decreased demand, there was no real reason to get cute with this. You look at Academic Pharmacy Now, it just says, okay, well, we had a high in applications of 85,000, and we have a low, a reduction of those applications down to about 65,000. And there's no argument over this. There's decreased demand. And the article did say that some of this reduction in applications comes from the significant increase in early decision, and that's going to be a big part of our conversation. Okay, so we've got increased supply, decreased demand, and so now we have decreased student loan debt. Everybody's happy, right? Wait a minute. Why do I feel like I'm reading Dragons Love Tacos? Like, wait a minute. We didn't look at the fine print. What happened? For those of you that have children, you're getting exactly what I'm throwing at you there. Okay, well, let's look at this and say, okay, well, are the privates the problem? Privates have this slope, and it's certainly a higher number. And the publics have the same slope, and I know this for sure. Our state has absolutely decimated the Regents colleges, and no fault of their own. It's just a continued thing that the states are less and less supplying the public schools. It's just something that's across the board. But this number is just huge. So in 2012, if I graduated, I'd owe $40,000 less than in 2017. That just seems like a big number. And then, of course, it's 30,000 for the publics, 46 for the privates. But why are we having this giant increase when supply has gone up and demand has gone down? Okay, so that's the puzzle. That doesn't make sense. We should have had, decreased debt. We should have increased efficiency. Schools should have been competing heavily for students, and students should be getting more and more scholarships. Why didn't that happen? Okay, well, let's look. So first of all, the number went up, the demand has gone down, and my hypothesis has been proven a failure. So subsequent debt of students has risen really, really high. Why has this happened? And I'm going to go through my conversation, but I honestly want to know. I don't know, because I advise students on their way to pharmacy school, and I want to know, why did this happen? Why are they going to pay more? Is the pharmacy degree 37%? Let's go back to that number. Is the pharmacy degree worth 32% more now than it was in 2012? I don't know the answer to that. But I want to start the conversation of what's going on. That makes no sense. We increase supply, decrease demand. Why did that not drive down tuition costs? Because what we want to do is we want to drive down costs and reduce student loan debt. That's a win for all students. Okay? So something must be happening that students are buying high instead of waiting for low. Okay? And I'm going to give you kind of these three things that I think and the reasons why. So generally, the only reason someone would buy high instead of low is if there's an emotional component, or that they don't have enough information and they think they're buying at a value when they're actually making a bad decision. So the first thing is students are making decisions without the information they need. And you'll see this is the Barbara Bush decision-making process. I thought that would make it kind of concrete, and I'll talk about that. Students are applying to very few schools. So it used to be 6 applications per student. Now it's only 4. And I know the cost is high of applying and visiting schools is high, but I assure you the cost of getting the wrong school is much, much higher. And I don't know, as an 18-year-old or as a 21-year-old, could I have done that? I just don't know. I would probably say no. I don't think I had necessarily the maturity or funds to do that. And then, do students have an algorithm to know what to do when an acceptance comes? Yay, got accepted. Okay, well, what are you going to do? Okay, and I've got an algorithm and some resources for you. Okay, so incomplete information. I love this quote. Barbara Bush, I married the first man I ever kissed. When I tell this to my children, they just about throw up. Barbara Bush. So, would you marry the first person you ever kissed, high school sweetheart, all those things? Okay, well, I know what happens. Okay, but can we make the analogy, and does it go towards pharmacy schools? So let's first look at how many campuses participate in early decision. So this is your chance to, make an educated guess. There are about 142 schools of pharmacy. So I just divided by 4. Is it closest to 36? Do 25% of schools? And why would you use early decision as a school? Well, schools that have, like the Harvards and Yales, have so many applications that if you apply to this early thing, then you can, get those best students. So that's kind of the mindset behind it. 72, which would be 50% of the schools, 108, which is 75% of the schools, and 142, do all schools participate in this? And the answer? 110, which is a little bit higher than this 108. So almost 3/4 of schools participate in early decision. Why? That's just weird. There, as a percentage, the Ivy League is just a small, tiny group of schools. The Ivy League of Pharmacy is not 108 out of 142. By definition, you can't be the top elite percent if you are in the majority. So that doesn't make sense at all. Early decision is meant for the elite schools to provide a way for students who are willing to commit themselves, okay, to one college because the competition is so high. Okay, 75% of the schools cannot be elite. It just can't be that way. It just can't mathematically. Okay, so why would the schools participate? The schools participated because it was in their best interest. And this makes sense. I'm not vilifying the schools. I'm saying they had to do this. If you were a school that saw that the other schools started jumping on this bandwagon of early admission, then you're going to lose some of the best students. Okay? So if that's the case, it's in the best interest of a college of pharmacy to participate. But why would a student participate? Okay. So a student participates in, the Harvard-Yale deal because, there's acceptance rates of what? It's like 7% or 8%, somewhere between 7 and 12% at those elites. This is an opportunity to say, look, I'm really committed to Harvard. I'm really committed to Yale. I feel that I'm an excellent student, and I am putting all of my eggs in this one basket and saying that you are my first choice. Okay? And what it would do is it would remove the emotional burden of having to wait. And this is what happens with pharmacy, is that it removes the emotional burden of having to wait. You get your acceptances by October 20th. That sounds really cool. Like to get to know you're in pharmacy school by October. Okay. And the other thing is avoiding rejection. Now, as a profession, we have a lot of introverts because there's just not a lot of people going and taking organic chemistry and partying a ton. Okay, so that doesn't necessarily go together exactly, but is avoiding rejection part of this deal? And I'm only talking about this because of a book I've recently read called Rejection Proof. I'll talk about that in a further slide. But let's look about logic. That's emotion. Okay, it's logical for a school to do it. It's emotional for a student to do it. Okay, so what happens if a student changes his or her mind? And you can look at the PharmCast thing on this, but you can't apply to a pharmacy school in the current application cycle. You have to wait for next year. You are locked in. So is there a logical financial benefit? Okay, so first of all, those Harvard-Yale people that are applying, the numbers come out at something like 60% of those students don't take on any debt. Okay, so those guys are fully funded and there's no financial issue. They're just like, I'm just trying to get in the best school. My family's got it. They got my back, no problem. But in pharmacy land, and we went all the way back to that, 86% are taking debt. So that's a completely different thing. So what is the logical financial benefit? And I want to be 100% transparent here. I don't know. But to me, and I'm just looking at the numbers, it sounds like you have to take the admission regardless of the financial package or try again next year. But aren't financial packages offered after a letter of admission? The FAFSA, the first time you can fill it out is in January. So you are locked into a school that you chose, but you don't know financially how much it's going to cost you, and you have nothing to compare it to. Or I'll talk about comparisons in a minute. But FAFSA we fill out in January to March because you have to have last year's W-2s and income statements. So I think what's happening is that makes no logical sense. Okay, so let's look at this incomplete information. Here's Barbara Bush. I married the first man I ever kissed. When I tell this story to my children, they just about throw up. And so she has an N of 1. Okay. Let's change it around just a little bit just for fun. I went to the first pharmacy school I applied to when I tell this to my children, and then how would you finish that sentence? Okay. And I put you. Okay. I'll finish it for you. I went to the first pharmacy school I applied to. When I tell this to my children, I tell them that in 1992, when I applied to pharmacy school, the tuition at Maryland was really low, and it was one of the best schools in the country, and I was willing to apply again the next year. So I applied to the first and only pharmacy school because I had such a good pharmacy school in state and such a low cost that it actually made sense for me to wait a whole nother year. And I think that early decision creates a real bad situation for a lot of people. I just don't know. Okay. So why is this incomplete information? And that incomplete information term I'm sort of taking from this book I'll share with you called Algorithms to Live By. But you're comparing tuition estimating value based on your estimate from information you've gathered. So you are relying on you as an 18 to 21 year old to estimate the financial burden of pharmacy school and that you have made a best value decision. I don't know if that's the case. So as a 21-year-old, I had a lot less to compare it to. And because, as you saw before, 75% of the schools were public, then I would pay out of state at 75% of the schools, increasing the cost. That's not really the case now with all of these privates. Okay, so you are relying on your estimate as an 18 to 21 year old or whatever age you are going in. But looking at the data, at least half of the students are in the early 20s. So a student who applies in the regular cycle to multiple schools, though, compares tuition and value based on multiple letters of financial commitment. That is concrete data. That is, hey, I've got a letter of acceptance, and this school is going to charge me this much for 4 years, and this one's going to charge me this much. Okay? And so that's a very different amount of information. Okay. So what you should do? Well, I think, and I use Audible because I've got 3 6-year-olds. I don't have time to actually read books, so I don't actually read books. I just listen to them. But I have I think I'm over 200. Listened to over 200 books in the last 2 or 3 years. So Algorithms to Live By. Chapter 1. Honestly, Chapter 1 will give you what you need, and then I think you'll not be able to stop reading it. But they have this thing called the 37% rule for optimal stopping problems, where they say that if you're looking for an apartment and you're going to look for a month, you should stop after 37%. That's the optimal time to stop. And then they talk about parking. It's really actually pretty helpful. It's really pragmatic, but it tells you how long to wait to get to a good parking spot and things like that. And somebody who lived from Baltimore City, that actually would have been really helpful. But I think this will give you a lot more information, will help you quite a bit. And then rejection proof. You might have to go a little bit deeper into this book, but rejection proof talks about this guy, and what he did was he went out and tried to get rejected 100 times. And this 5th try, he went out and went to a Krispy Kreme and said, "Can you make me 5 donuts in the shape of the Olympic rings?" And they did, and it went viral, and his life changed forever. But what I'm wondering is, are students applying to early decision because they're fearing rejection? And what I guess I'm getting at is that are students making emotional decisions that are crushing them financially later? And that's where I want to welcome your comments. I don't know, but I think that's what's happening. I think students are going in and they're saying, wait a minute, I can get into a school and I can have maybe only 1 rejection at most, and then most of them aren't. Because if you think about it, most people that are applying to pharmacy school, especially that early decision part, they've never failed. So that is a genuine fear, and fear is a tremendous motivator. Well, let's look just a little bit about some of the other thoughts that I had. There's that British saying y'all penny wise and pound foolish, where you're making decisions with a small amount of money, pennies. So the application fees, visits to the school, things like that end up making bad sense for the affecting large amount of money, the 3 to 4 years of tuition. So pounds is in the Great British Pounds. And the idea is that, are you limiting the number of applications because you're like, man, I got no money now. I'm a broke college student. So I'm just going to apply to X number of schools. Okay. And I think that might be a very bad decision. Okay. Again, this is all conjecture. I'm just trying to solve this puzzle and get your help. So in a rapidly expanding supply, it kind of makes sense to find out which school would provide the best value. And here is where we have so much trouble doing apples to apples. Okay. This is why I'm especially not going to vilify the privates, because it's much more likely at a private that you're going to get a dual degree. Okay, at least in who I've talked to as part of the Pharmacy Future Leaders on the Pharmacy podcast. And here's number one kind of thing is that, well, how many degrees are you getting? Oh, you only got one? Because what I'm seeing is that a student with a PharmD MBA has two completely different routes that they can take. Okay. And I hate that it goes PharmD MBA just because the PharmD has more years than the MBA. Because if this was available to me, I would have been all over it. That would have made me go out of state. That would have taken me to different places. Because I know there's this huge push towards clinical, but my interest was always in the MBA side of it. I just find it kind of fascinating and enjoy doing kind of the inventory stuff and making the business work. I think that's fun, and I did really well as a manager for a number of years. Prestige. Pharmacy schools don't have prestige like the Ivies and the pseudo Ivies like Duke and Georgetown and Stanford. Now, there's an importance in alumni network, but then there's residency acceptance rates and things like that. But I just don't know how many schools have that prestige value in the pharmacy world. Completion rates, this is actually really tough to find and one of the most important things that you should look at. What I should have written on here is that the average attrition rate is 11%. And I should do a whole thing on this one, is 11% across the board over the last 5 years. So you need to compare the completion rate based on that 11%. So where is your school next to that? And be careful because the numbers are kind of tricky. You don't want to look at it and go, oh, well, it's just 2% different. What you want to look at is those standard deviations and like, whoa, that is way different than it should be. Okay, so any college that has a completion rate that's higher than 89%, that's a very good thing. And then when you see it lower than 89%, that's a really bad thing. That means you're in the bottom half of schools. Okay, and then the pass rate. So the NAPLEX, what's the number of students or percentage of students passing the boards on the first try? This is easy to find. You just go to the NABP website. And there's been a precipitous drop, okay? And there are a lot of schools, there are a couple schools that are in the 50s and 60s. So when you have poor completion rate and poor pass rate, you can get to the point where, it's like 3 out of 5 that you're going to graduate and pass the boards, which is not good. You should really be much higher than that. So again, my job is not to vilify schools and look at schools individually. That's up to you. I hope somebody does make a calculator or something like that. That would be really cool. And then financial aid. This is the one that's kind of the apples to apples. How much support does a school commit to you in writing? And be careful. This is not the amount of tuition compared to other listed tuitions, which is what you're doing if you're going early decision, because you have no idea how much someone else would want you. And so this is kind of the reject yourself thing. Be careful about rejecting yourself. You didn't go to another school and say, hey, what would you actually have given me? What would you actually have provided? You don't have that number. And I'm going to talk about applying to a few schools and how that's kind of probably a bad thing. Okay, so N equals 1, the Barbara Bush option. I took this because I was willing to reapply the next year. I had very low tuition, very high prestige at Maryland. I graduated with $40,000 worth of debt. And I think I'm going to do a podcast episode soon. Let me know if you value it. But I paid off my student loan debt in one check, and then my wife had 25,000 left, and then I just paid that off too. So I'd like to just pay it off in one check. This whole letting it nag at you just killed me. But I retired retail around my 8th or 9th year in. So financially I did really well, and I had a good kind of entrepreneurial journey. But my end was one. I took the Barbara Bush option. I thought Maryland was the very best school, and it was amazing value. Yeah, it allowed me to stay at home for some of my APPEs, and it was just a phenomenal experience. I can't recommend it even more. Although they have this campus 6 miles from my house, which is kind of a bummer. N equals 4 with the 37% rule. I think that puts you at about 2 or more schools that have returned decisions. And I want to be careful here. I'm not a statistician. I have no idea. But I just want to point out that the average medical school student applies to 14 schools. The average pharmacy student applies to 4. Okay. So the average medical student, let's say they were getting acceptances and they had to answer without knowing what was going to happen with the ones after it, then they would actually start after number 5. That's when they would say, okay, you are the best acceptance I've ever seen after number 5, and that's when you take it. What you really want is perfect information, which is an N of 4 or more, and you get all the acceptances at the same time. You have perfect information, and you know what to do. Okay. So what's the ideal situation? Well, you apply to as many schools as you can. I'm not telling you to apply to schools you don't want, but I'm saying that you want to get the results back at the same time so you can compare apples to apples. And what does this have to do with student loan debt? Well, the question is did you get the best value? Are you trading emotional discomfort at application time only to lose financial peace of mind after college? The one cookie or two is that they did this experiment with kids, and they said if you wait, you can have 2 cookies, and I don't think they told them how long it would be. I think it'd be like 10, 15 minutes. Otherwise, you can just take 1 cookie now. Okay. And some kids are like, I'm having a cookie. 1 cookie sounds good right now. And they found that those that waited for the 2 cookies actually did better in life, throughout the whole thing, and being able to put off that satisfaction. So how much is the tuition difference? Well, the tuition difference between public and private, I showed you that already. In terms of borrowed money, is about $50,000 across the board. But the tuition difference between one college and another can be over $100,000 for the 3 to 4 years. And so the question is, are you trading the emotional discomfort at application time for a penalty of $100,000 or more? And there's a lot of data you'd have to gather and all this stuff, but the whole counterintuitive thing is, if demand went down and supply went up, shouldn't tuitions go down? Okay, and I think the answer comes from something happening that students are buying high and not taking advantage of the market forces. Okay. And then number 3, lack of an algorithm. So acceptances come back at different times with time limits. Hey, you need to send this back in 2 weeks, or that's what I've heard. I don't know. I haven't applied to pharmacy school since early 90s. So this is an artificial emotional tension because you don't have perfect information. So how do we get perfect information? Well, contact the other schools and say, hey, I got an acceptance, and I would like to be able to compare that acceptance to your acceptance. Okay? Or talk to the school that sent you the acceptance and say, hey, I want to compare this to other schools. And I would totally be like, well, my parents want this, and I would bring them into it. I really would. It's completely different now than it was when I was a kid. Now I think it is a time to bring in parents. It is a time to ask for their advice and to listen. And I've talked to a number of people in the Pharmacy Future Leaders, and families are a huge, huge part of the decision. And just having their financial perspective on up and down markets is so valuable, because many of you applying now in 2008, I don't know how much that hit you, but that was 10 years ago. So you would have been like 8 to 11. So I don't know how much you would have noticed that. Okay. So what's the solution? Well, if there was no early admission and students got all their acceptances or rejections at the same time, students could speak to each other on social media and other channels and make the best decisions based on the collective information. Can you imagine that Reddit board? That would blow up. That would be crazy. Having thousands of students going in there like, what? They gave you such and such, financial aid, or that school. I think it would create this tremendous, tremendous empowerment of the people that are applying. Can this ever happen? I'm not feeling that. I don't think so. But that would be really cool if the Pharmcast just said, you know what, early decision was meant to help elite schools that have the problem of too many applications allow students to say that they are first. They are their only choice. But obviously, if over 75% of schools are applying an early decision, then that's not the case. You can't have an elite if you have the majority. It just can't happen. But should you apply to pharmacy school? Yeah, if you want to be a pharmacist. But the logical counter-emotional process includes applying to multiple schools, avoiding early decision, and working with the most and best information you can about value. And that kind of brings to a conclusion. So in 3 weeks, a lot of students will have their early decision come back to them. And mathematically, I can actually figure out, it doesn't really take much work, to figure out if they should take it. Okay. And so while you'll be committed, you take the early decision, you get accepted, but then when financial aid comes in spring, you can actually mathematically figure out very easily if you should take it based on projected income, based on loss of income, and based on the debt that you're going to incur. For me, I did that math and I got accepted, so I didn't have to deal with it. But let's say I got turned down. Okay, then I would have finished my last year of undergraduate, and I would have gotten a degree, and I could have started working. And then I would have applied again, and now I would have I would have actually lost a little bit of money by applying later, because the cost was so low relative to the income. So my income was around 65 or 70,000, and my debt was 40,000. So my income was, almost 100% of, or twice my debt. Now income is about half. So I know it's a little bit of fuzzy math and I'm kind of going along, but I just don't think that you should make an emotional decision justified logically. I think you should make a logical decision justified logically. That's kind of the take home. But I really want your comments, because I spent a lot of time on this, 2 hours just this morning, an hour last night, and it really breaks my heart to see what's happening with the student loan debt, and to see what's happening with students, and that they're not able to go into these entrepreneurial ventures because of this crushing debt, and now they're scared to kind of go out there and leap at other opportunities. So please do comment on the video.